Hi everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes you just feel a bit down and find it hard to make even simple decisions, while other times you feel more optimistic and ready to take on the world? Well, this new study dives deep into how our feelings, especially negative ones, might be playing a huge role in how we make choices, especially when things are uncertain. Imagine facing a fork in the road where you don't know which path leads to a great reward and which leads to a loss. That is pretty much what having to make decisions under ambiguity feels like. This research looked at how feeling anxious or depressed affects these kinds of decisions. They used a clever task that's been used with both humans and animals to gauge this. It's like a mood detector for your brain. They found that when people feel more anxious or depressed, they tend to lean towards the safer, less rewarding option, almost like they're expecting the worst. But here is a twist: they also explored whether just being a naturally pessimistic person, separate from your current mood, makes a difference. So, the big question this study is tackling is, how do our feelings influence our decisions when we're not sure what the outcome will be? Think about choosing whether to invest in a risky but potentially high-paying stock or the safe option that gives you a small guaranteed return. This is where things get interesting because our emotions can really sway us. Scientists have developed this cool thing called a judgment bias task. It's like a game where you have to guess whether something is a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. But the trick is, sometimes it is just slightly tilted, and you have to decide if it's tilted enough to mean a big reward or just a small one. If you're feeling good, you might be more likely to guess it is tilted towards the big reward, showing what they call an optimistic bias. But if you're feeling down, you might lean towards the smaller reward, showing a pessimistic bias. What is really neat is that they started using this task with animals like rats and found similar patterns. Animals that were stressed or feeling down were slower to anticipate the reward. In this study, the researchers recruited a lot of people online to play a version of this judgment bias task. Before they played, everyone filled out questionnaires about how anxious and depressed they'd been feeling lately. They also filled out a questionnaire about whether they tend to be a generally optimistic or pessimistic person. So, they had a good snapshot of people's general outlook and their current mood. The game itself involved looking at tilted shapes and deciding if they were tilted left or right. Some shapes were clearly tilted, and you learned if that meant a big reward or a small reward. Then they showed them shapes that were only slightly tilted. These were the ambiguous ones. Their responses to these ambiguous shapes were key. They got a pretty good number of people, over 500, to participate in this online experiment. They were paid for their time, which is always a good way to get people involved. They made sure the participants were positioned correctly in front of their screens and that their screens were calibrated, which is important for accurate visual tasks. They used Gabor patches, which are basically these cool visual patterns that can be tilted. The task had two unequivocal stimuli, meaning they were clearly tilted left or right, and two ambiguous stimuli, which were only slightly tilted. When they got the unambiguous ones right, they'd get either a big reward of 4 or a smaller reward of 1. The tricky part was the ambiguous stimuli. Pressing a certain key was considered the optimistic response, meaning they were guessing it would lead to the high reward. Pressing the other key was the pessimistic response, leaning towards the low reward. Essentially, they were trying to see if people would guess the big reward or the small reward when they weren't sure. They used some smart computer programs to analyze all the data. They excluded really fast or really slow responses because they figured those weren't really thoughtful decisions. Then they looked at how the scores from the questionnaires related to how many optimistic choices people made in the game. They were particularly interested in whether higher anxiety, depression, or pessimism scores meant fewer optimistic choices. Now, this is where it gets really cool and a bit technical. To understand how these feelings affect decisions, they use something called drift diffusion modeling. Imagine making a decision as a little ball of evidence rolling towards one of two buckets, one for yes and one for no, or in this case, one for high reward and one for low reward. This model looks at not just what choice you made, but also how quickly you made it. It helps figure out if someone is just generally biased towards one bucket from the start, or if the ball of evidence itself starts rolling slower or faster towards one bucket during the decision process. So what did they find? Well, the average person made about 60% optimistic choices, but people who reported higher levels of anxiety and depression tended to make fewer optimistic choices. That is, when they felt more anxious and depressed, they were more likely to choose the option associated with the smaller reward when the choice was ambiguous. This confirms what many previous studies have suggested: negative feelings can indeed make us more pessimistic in our decision making. Interestingly, even though people who scored high on anxiety and depression also tended to score high on general pessimism, the study found no direct link between how generally pessimistic someone was on that scale and how they performed on the judgment bias task. This is a really significant finding. It suggests that the bias towards making pessimistic choices might be more about your current emotional state, your anxiety and depression symptoms, rather than a fixed personality trait of pessimism. This surprised the researchers, and it makes you wonder if the terms optimistic and pessimistic are even the best way to describe what's happening. Especially when talking about animals, maybe positively biased and negatively biased would be more accurate. Now, let's look at what the drift diffusion model revealed. Remember the ball of evidence rolling towards a decision bucket. The study found that higher anxiety scores were linked to a lower drift rate. What does that mean? It means that the evidence was accumulating more slowly towards a decision. This suggests that the negative bias, the tendency to choose the less rewarding option, isn't because people are starting with a preset bias. Instead, it's something that happens during the decision-making process itself, as if their brains are taking longer to build up the confidence to make a choice. And in that slower process, negative thoughts or feelings might be tipping the scales. The study also found that higher anxiety led to a reduced drift rate, and that the proportion of optimistic responses was super strongly linked to this drift rate, which makes sense. When it came to depression, they found something a little different. Higher depression scores were associated with an increased threshold separation. In the drift diffusion model, this means that more information, more evidence was needed before making a decision. This could suggest that people with higher depression scores are being more cautious, requiring more certainty before committing to a choice, even though the evidence is fairly clear. Crucially, they found no significant effect of anxiety or depression on the start point bias. This means that people weren't starting the decision-making process with a pre-existing lean towards the pessimistic choice. The bias, as the abstract hints, seems to be generated during the decision-making process. So, to wrap up the main findings, this study strongly confirms that feeling more anxious and depressed leads to choosing less rewarding options when faced with uncertainty. This effect seems to stem from a slower accumulation of evidence during the decision-making process, rather than a preset negative outlook. The finding that dispositional pessimism, as measured by the Lothar questionnaire, didn't directly impact the judgment bias task is quite important. It highlights that the emotional state of anxiety and depression might be the primary driver of these pessimistic-like choices, rather than a general tendency to be a pessimist. It's like saying that feeling bad right now has a more immediate effect on our choices than being a pessimist. This could mean that when we talk about animals being optimistic or pessimistic based on these tasks, we need to be careful with our language, as it might be more about their current state than a fixed personality. The drift diffusion modeling really shines a light on the mechanics. The idea that anxiety slows down the evidence accumulation suggests that maybe people with anxiety are more hesitant, more careful, or perhaps more easily distracted by potential negative outcomes, which slows down their ability to reach a firm decision. And the increased threshold separation for depression could mean that people experiencing depression need a much stronger signal to feel confident in their choice. A key limitation they pointed out is the very high overlap between anxiety and depression. Because these two conditions often go hand in hand, it was hard to definitively say whether anxiety or depression was more responsible for the negative bias. They suggested future studies might need to use more specific measures to tease this apart. They also noted that this study sampled from the general population, and the effect sizes were small, suggesting these biases might be even more pronounced in individuals diagnosed with mood disorders. They also mentioned other factors that could influence the results, like age and sex. Older participants tended to make fewer optimistic choices, and males were more optimistic than females. They also acknowledged that they didn't measure IQ, which could play a role, and that different types of rewards or punishments in the task could influence the results differently for different emotional states. For example, a reward versus punishment design might be more sensitive to anxiety, while a high versus low reward design might be more relevant to depression. One final thought is about the time frame. The questionnaires looked at feelings over the past 2 weeks, but in the short time of the experiment, people's moods can fluctuate. Winning a big reward might boost someone's mood for the next few trials, influencing their decisions. Future research could try to capture these moments. moment emotional shifts. So, what does this all mean for us? It really underscores how our emotional state is not just something we feel, but something that actively shapes our thinking and our choices, especially when things are uncertain. Feeling anxious or depressed can make us more cautious, more risk-averse, and more likely to expect negative outcomes. It's not necessarily a personal failing, but a cognitive bias driven by our affective state. This kind of research can help us understand why people might struggle with decision-making when they're feeling low, and it highlights the importance of mental well-being for making effective choices in all areas of life. It also reminds us that personality traits and temporary emotional states can have different impacts, and we need precise tools to understand them. What do you think about these findings? Does this resonate with your own experiences? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more fascinating insights into the human mind. See you next time.